A few years ago, in Central Europe, we were watching what was going on here at Kyiv's Independence Square. And we were shocked by Yankovic's regime and the way they treated their own people. And perhaps we felt like we were not really involved in this. But how do we feel several years later? What is the reality like? In Slovakia, a journalist and his fiancée were murdered. In the Czech Republic, there is a debate on whether the Prime Minister was involved in the kidnapping of his son to occupied Crimea. In Poland and Hungary, we see processes leading to authoritarian regimes, something we could see in Slovakia during Mečier's government. And suddenly, this past of Maidan does not seem so distant anymore. Looking at the Visegrad countries, I can feel that there is a lot of harshness and impoliteness in public life, in the way we treat each other, the way we perceive each other. Today, we've invited writers to our Maidan discussion because these people work with sensitivity instead of impoliteness or harshness. And we want to ask them what it is like to live in our region these days. So this is the first question for Petra Hulova. What is the basic feeling about current Czech Republic? Let me start in a more general way. In his essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, Milan Kundera wrote about the revolutions in Central European countries in the 1950s and 60s. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. He wrote about the events occurring from the 50s to the 70s. Kundera mentions the connection between culture and life. The way I understand it, those movements against the then regimes stood on the same side of the barricade. They were bound together. It was the intellectuals, the culture, and together with them were the people. It may sound weird, but people and culture were on the same side. And it was a fortunate connection. It was actually the opposite of what is going on in Europe nowadays. I would talk about the Czech Republic, but perhaps there could be similar tendencies in Hungary or Poland. You can see the intellectuals are called, for example, by the Czech president, the café elite. And is meant to be derogatory. They seem to be separated from ordinary people. But what I find important and where I see the role of the intellectuals is the task to understand. To understand the situation. Because the rise of populism that we have witnessed across Central Europe, as well as this impoliteness and harshness you mentioned, these are not things that happened out of the blue. It is a sort of reaction. And let us ask the question, what triggered this reaction? And what should we do about it? Instead of escalating this spiral of hate and aggression. So the basic idea about the Czech Republic is the alienation of elites, their distance from ordinary people. Certainly, it could be seen this way. I feel something like this. Is there anything like that in Hungary? Well, I do have some perspective on how this transpires in Hungary, but I have a much more serious insight into the developments in Transcarpathia, in Ukraine, to what extent it influences life there. Perhaps it's lucky that this is only a small community on 30,000 square kilometers that took a very strange and catastrophic course throughout history. As locally, it is not just on the level of politics that we experience having to understand the other, and not only their language, but also their soul, and we have to live through it in everyday life, as there are Russians, Ukrainians, Rusyns, Hungarians, Jews, and Roma living together in a very small community, and without relying on each other, depending on each other, tolerating each other, we couldn't achieve anything. What is characteristic and has to be mentioned is that this tiny area practically belonged to 7 countries over the course of 1 century, which can prove in itself that us Central Europeans, if we want to, can cooperate. We can understand each other, irrespective of the difference in languages. Back to Transcarpathia, this area could be an example of the potential of coexistence and empathy. For if there are tensions in Transcarpathia nowadays, and in the last few years, unfortunately, this has been more and more frequent. They are always inspired from outside. Now about Poland. For me, it is surprising that this proud country, with its history full of suffering and struggling for freedom, is now acting the way it does. Probably we can use many words to describe the situation, but I'd like to hear it from a Pole. What is contemporary Poland like? I think that Poland is much divided. When you ask me about Poland, I ask you what you actually mean. You mean Poland as an imaginary union of citizens, or the government, society? Recently, I read an essay by Kundera. I can't say it has improved my mood. Maybe it has, in the way that irony can make you smile. However, the statements made at the beginning of the essay that Hungary and Poland are the only countries ready to die for Europe when we read it today and understand by Poland its government, it sounds a little bit Machiavellian, since the president of my country talks about Europe as an imaginary union. While the Prime Minister of that country during his local election campaign says that the EU subsidies are enough for pavements in Polish cities. At the same time, according to surveys, the number of the Poles who are happy to be part of the EU is higher than in other countries. I don't consider myself an expert in anything besides poetry. However, analysing events from my private perspective of a person who is 70 plus, and who encountered unexpected things that were impossible to be predicted. I could tell that the dreams of my generation unexpectedly came true. And it would be great to live the rest of one's life among dreams that came true. Apparently, there is no end to the unexpected events happening worldwide. And I think that situation in Poland, surprisingly, reminds me of my childhood and youth. As a result of the fight against communism, still carried out by some in society and the government, these days remind me a little bit of the times of the real socialism that were thought to have sunk into oblivion forever. Petra mentioned an interesting thing. She talked about the distance between elites and other people, which is something that was suggested during communism, that there is a difference between useless intellectuals and working people. In Hungary, intellectuals are derogatively called the Soros children, and I believe it may be similar in Poland. Petra said there must be a reason for this, and there is no point in getting angry, but we need to understand where it comes from. So how did it happen, this division of society? I don't mean to talk about the whole of Central Europe. I believe Czech society has undergone some frustration because of the post-revolution progress. Almost 30 years, people fought for democracy in the Velvet Revolution of 1989. But what they got in the first place, and nobody expected it really, was capitalism. Which I perceive as some sort of merciless system. It is quite cruel because it's oriented on increasing consumerism. And this spiral is unsustainable. And many people feel like they were consumed by it. They are not doing well in economic terms. I think the failure of intellectual elites after 1989 is that they were not aware of these aspects of capitalism. They profited from the positive aspects. And the next thing is that whoever tried to criticize the situation was labeled as a communist. So the mainstream, the political establishment, was impossible to be criticized, in fact. I don't mean to say this is the only reason, but it's certainly something which was present in the background and enabled the rise of populism in the Czech Republic. And if we want to do something about it, we should be aware of this background. We should focus on it and try to understand it, instead of criticizing people and complaining they vote for populists. Is there anything similar in Hungary and Poland? Is there any frustration about capitalism? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It's very interesting that here in Central Europe we continuously tend to compare ourselves with the West as a benchmark. But that is a big mistake, as this part of Europe did not take the same course throughout history as Western Europe, so we can't expect it to take advantage of the same means and the same options as the West. So, in my opinion, it would be important for the Visegrad 4 countries, or the Central and Eastern European countries, to finally find their own answers to the questions. The questions are the same. It's possible that the content of the answers will also be the same. But it can have a different impact in an environment where democracy is only a few decades old, as opposed to a place where democracy is centuries old. We don't need to be ashamed, but we have to accept that in this respect we have more to do. In my opinion, beyond politicians, thinking people should understand this. Writers, journalists, philosophers who can step back a little from politics, who can be liberated from political pressure. The moment any country's government at any time can finally hear the civil society's idea or signal, even if they don't accept it altogether, if they are willing to take those steps, then we can hope for the situation to improve here as well. How about Poland? Do you also have the intellectual elite called derogatory names? Intellectuals, such as journalists, artists, sociologists, etc., are mocked for allegedly not working, not doing real jobs. That term was often used in communist propaganda. Now, nobody talks about cafe. They are talking about topoly. And what we witness at the moment is a change of false elites for the real ones. However, that attempt was not successful. In Poland, it is hard to find good actors, writers, philosophers, whatever the word good means. But it means something anyway. Who would belong to the party? The ruling party was not, and probably will not be, successful in it. Coming back to the essay by Kundera, he said that God has abandoned us. And now it's culture that is abandoning us. Kundera doesn't know what is going to replace it. I think he was right. Culture is abandoning us, maybe unwillingly. And I don't want to blame here any party or political movement. For me, it is related to a lack of any kind of If you go to any web portal, you can see unimportant things next to important ones. News about some celebrity showing too much when her bra fell down is placed next to information about a ferry that sank with a few hundred people. I will return to what Petra mentioned. Is it also true for Poland that the change of values after 1989 is connected with frustration from capitalism? Certainly. We can talk about frustration caused by capitalism in some part. Maybe 1/3 of society. Now, domestic policy also causes frustration. A main slogan used by the winning party during the previous parliamentary elections was Poland in ruin. That slogan is absurd for any person who looks, sees and remembers anything, since, for the last years, Poland has improved in an absolutely unbelievable way. I have two reactions. One of them is about the lack of hierarchy in contemporary society. I believe that hierarchy is sort of a taboo. This word is not really acceptable in some ways, and I believe it is also connected with this thing about the elite. The problem with the elite that we have now, because the elite is a group of people who have certain claims, and there is this sense of hierarchy. And when we refuse to accept this, we also refuse to accept the fact that there are any elites at all, and that we may listen to them, or that we may somehow be interested. Why has it become a taboo? In my opinion, it is connected with the ethos of equality. But I turned into a demolition of the public space. It is like a dream turned into a nightmare. And I also have one more comment about catching up with the West. I believe this is something we should really get rid of, because it is largely based on economic indicators, which is very limiting. It leads to a kind of tunnel vision. It is easy because you can turn it into figures, and you can do benchmarking and spreadsheets. But we can all feel the quality. We know what it is like to be in Central and Eastern Europe. There is this quality you can't find in Western Europe. And this applies to the public space. How to describe it? It's some kind of warmness, perhaps liveliness. It is something you can't really find in Western countries. No matter how smoothly things work there. My experience is different, but never mind. You described the sensitivity, warmness, or lively feeling. Now, let's have a look at the question of migration and the refugee crisis. I don't mean to start the discussion on whether we should or should not accept the quotas on refugees. That is a completely different debate. But let's talk about the way we handled these discussions in Central Europe, especially in the Visegrad countries. Our approach to migration was we didn't even want to accept orphaned children. We wanted to avoid all refugees. In Hungary, we claim we need to stop Islamization of Europe. The way migration was approached is completely different from what you mentioned. It is the opposite. It seems inhuman, heartless, and unfriendly. So I don't know how to understand this. In my opinion, this is connected with the fact that many people see refugees or migrants as Muslims, and they are afraid of Islam. That's the point, this fear. They are afraid of this religion, and they are afraid of different mentality, because that's how they see it. They see it as a threat. I can understand fear, but what about those reactions? The way people speak about refugees is terrible. You are right. But the way the language is used by those who defend migration can be very annoying. I sometimes find the way they speak very hard to listen to. It often seems like a cheap gesture meant to help them feel good about themselves and show others how morally superior they are. Talking about the responses to the refugee crisis, what does it say about contemporary Hungary and Poland? Before I talk about this, I'd refer back to the similarity in mentality between the Polish and Hungarian soul. Indeed, it's imaginable. And we have to refer to history. It is defined and motivated by historical existence. But I'm afraid that neither in Hungary nor in Poland was a proper answer provided to the question of what should come after the existing socialism. So neither the Hungarian nor the Polish answers was right. I'm not sure if in other countries they know this grotesque saying. It pertains to the 70s. There are two ways before the Hungarian intelligentsia. One is alcoholism, and the other is impossible. I'm afraid all that has changed over the last 25 to 30 years is that now there are several ways before the Hungarian intelligentsia. One of them is alcoholism, and the others are impossible. And to react to the thought about how the rejection of Muslims and rejection of the crisis in Hungary has been elevated to a political level, it also proves that this is a very bad answer to a relatively good question. And this wrong answer will resonate constantly in the public consciousness until society is receptive. And I think this receptiveness is overestimated and overplayed. And I can also imagine that it's falsified by daily politics. And that's how they justify raising hatred that is not good for anyone. Refugees do not even want to go to Poland, obviously. So why are Polish people so afraid of them? I think it's in the nature of fear to be afraid of the unknown. It's in the nature of fear that fears can be easily provoked. If you repeat several times that refugees bring infections, parasites, and such illnesses which they are used to and can live with them in symbiosis, while elsewhere people are not immune to them. I think in the modern world we are giving up rational thinking.
Myślę, że generalnie w świecie jest jakiś odwrót znacznej części tego świata od racjonalnego.
Look at the movement against vaccination that recently became active in Poland.
Ostatnio w Polsce się zaktywizowały bardzo.
Such ideas like that shots contain heavy metals or are produced from human fetus, so internet knowledge.
Co najbardziej sensacyjne, stosunkowo najłatwiej do ludzi trafia, budzi ich zainteresowanie.
As you know, there is everything on the internet, but there are the most sensational things that people master and get interested in.
Ten strach przed uchodźcami
a government can either suppress or ignite. In Poland, we see igniting or even creating such fear. It was successful in a domestic policy and party fight. That fear, as well as the slogan "Poland in ruin," was a motive force of winning parliamentary elections. All three of you are writers. When I was 17, my friend Juraj Kuśnierek gave me an old samizdat book. Actually, just a bunch of papers. It was called The Power of the Powerless. As an ordinary boy from the Petržalka neighborhood of Bratislava, I had no idea what it was. I read this book and I was deeply touched. I was surprised, thinking, are there really people like that? People who are interested in the way we live, not just wages, full employment, and life during communism, but actually the way we live? In my opinion, this is the role of writers, to be the conscience of the people. I was deeply changed by this book. Now, in 2018, I am wondering, who took this role? Is it you, the writers? Is it journalists or politicians, actors and actresses? Or is there nobody in that role at all? Who is the conscience of the people? At the beginning, I talked about the role of intellectuals as those who try to understand and perhaps translate things between groups of people who do not understand each other so well. Another thing is the question whether someone is listening. And this is connected with the fact that the public space is not hierarchical. The question of authority is problematic. If there is someone who is the conscience of the people, this means it is someone who has the authority. And we don't want authority. We want to get rid of authority. This makes it very complicated. And again, I believe that intellectuals play this role, making people more understanding and sensitive. But the question is, who will listen? We will see. I will ask a personal question. Do you have the ambition or desire to make the Czech audience more sensitive? Would you like to be the conscience of the people? I certainly do. But, on the other hand, it is important to be heard in the public space. And for this, you need social media. And it is not impossible, but it gets complicated if you're not on Facebook. I left Facebook after the scandal with Cambridge Analytica, which proved that Facebook was used for commercial purposes. I felt like I didn't want to be part of someone's commercial project. So, in fact, you just play a stupid role in this project because those who operate Facebook want money. And so they want you to spend a lot of time there. But no matter how terrible this platform is, it provides the majority of today's communication. However, I find it so inconvenient that I don't want to be present on Facebook. Yet, without social media, your voice will not be heard very well. What about books? Are books less important than they used to be? Well, yes and no. There are more ways of spending free time, and reading is just one of the options you have. But as people's span of concentration tends to get shorter, they find it more and more difficult to read and focus on books. However, literature still has a great and significant role. Although this world is somehow against spending a lot of time reading. It is becoming more important to read, even more important than it used to be. Who has the role of the conscience of the people in Hungary and Poland? Who is the conscience of Poland? I don't think I have an answer for that question. I don't think there is a politician who would meet the criteria of the nation's conscience. I don't think you can name a priest who would meet such criteria.
Myślę, że artyści niekoniecznie są najbardziej powołani do tego, żeby być sumieniem.
I think artists are not necessarily called to be the conscience.
Sumienie jest czymś jakby najbardziej wewnętrznym. Znaczy, jeśli by pytanie brzmiało o
The conscience is something
pisarza,
internal.
na przykład w społeczeństwie dzisiaj, do czego chyba zmierzamy powolutku.
If you're asking about the role of the writer in modern society, what we are probably coming to
Zadaniem pisarza jest uświadamianie ludziom, co znaczą słowa i walka.
In my opinion, a writer has the task to understand the meaning of words and to give readers the knowledge for how to prevent others from manipulating you with words.
I wtedy, kiedy ktokolwiek, czy celebryta, czy polityk, czy
And anybody, a politician or a priest, twists the meaning of words, the reader would know those words mean something else and they are trying to fool them.
Próbuje go oszukać. I to jest to takie w tym sensie bym powiedział, że
And in that sense, writers can be called maybe not a conscience, but they help in the examination of conscience.
pomagać przy rachunku sumienia.
Posledná otázka. Sedíme na Majdane.
The last question is about the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, the square where people were dying a few years ago.
Pokus tejto krajiny.
This was not the first time this country struggled to be free.
Pokusy boli neúspešné a niektorí hovoria, že veľa tých
Some
pokusov
attempts
Ukrajina
were not successful, and some people believed there would be
2-3 roky,
not
čo sa
many
o
other opportunities for freedom.
slobodná Ukrajina tento štát snaží.
Now,
My sme z
something
krajín,
like a
ktoré
free Ukraine is emerging.
to zažili pred 28-9 rokmi.
We are from countries that made these attempts for freedom 29 years ago.
Svojimi chybami aj svojimi úspechmi.
We learn from our mistakes and also our achievements.
Čo by Ukrajina
Drawing
na ceste
upon our
bola,
experience,
aby bola
what can
slobodná,
Ukraine do to
mala
become a free country?
určite nemala robiť, tak ako sme to
What should
robili,
Ukraine
a
avoid?
čo by
Which
určite
mistakes
mala
can
robiť,
they prevent?
sme to my robili,
And what good
bolo to
things should they do?
Čo
What
by ste
would you recommend?
Ukrajincom povedali?
When it comes to corruption, it is big, but that also applies to the Czech Republic. This is a problem we have been facing for a long time. And I believe this is an area where the Ukrainians can achieve some changes. But then there are other things, like the terrible war, the conflict that is still going on. And so many Ukrainian people died because of this. And this is not something that the Ukrainians can change. It's not really under their control. Perhaps we should ask this question in a different way. How can we put Central and Eastern Europe together? How can we keep it more connected? Because I think that crazy thing about catching up with the West meant for many Central and Eastern European countries that they only orient themselves in the Western direction. And they sort of ignore their neighbours. As if we did not really see our neighbouring countries, and that is a pity. When you say this, my first idea is that in Central Europe, in Visegrad, we got connected, but we found that connection in the worst possible ways. Kaczynski, Orbán, Babiš, and the Slovak government stand together against certain EU initiatives. They are connected. But it is in wrong things and in wrong ways. I believe these things you mentioned are not the only example. It is also happening in other areas, not only among those politicians that you mentioned. But we elected these politicians. All right, but what does it say about us? I guess we might conclude that a half of our fellow citizens are stupid. But this is not what we want to say. This is not a solution, right? Hungary and Poland. What would you recommend to contemporary Ukraine from the experience of your country? So, it is the possibilities of Ukrainian-Hungarian relations that we should talk about. In my opinion, an honourable political dialogue, One that does not intentionally create an uncomfortable situation for the other party should be capable of solving all of the problems. In this case, as in every other case, I think what's missing is political will. It can't be the goal of politics to maintain a continuously perforated situation. Politics should solve situations. When I see a political will from both sides, I start hoping. Additionally, Ukraine needs Central Europe by all means. I understand that Ukraine considers itself much more similar to France or Germany, and they want to have primary, direct relations with these countries. But in my opinion, they take the right path if they notice that the way to a greater Europe is through Central Europe, through the Visegrad Four and Romania. The population of these countries is much closer in mentality to Ukraine than Western European countries. We understand each other's problems better, as we were in the same camp. And it would be very bad if Ukraine missed these opportunities. Is there anything from Poland's experience Ukraine can use? I think that giving advice is something else than wishing. Talking about wishes, I can articulate them, while I have no right to give advice. I can only give advice to my colleague poet, especially a young one. But I don't have the power to give advice to a country. Talking about wishes, I'd like the Polish policy towards Ukraine to be more stable and devoid of ad hoc elements that ignite conflicts. The internet is a terrible thing.
Ten internet jest niestety fatalny, bo jak człowiek sobie ślubuje, że nie będzie wchodził w komentarze.
When you promise yourself to restrain from commenting and don't follow through on the promise, you can feel depressed, having the impression that Poland is seething with anti-Ukrainian sentiments, which is not true. Although one can't deny that such sentiments appear. Looking back to the past instead of the future is a disaster. Not only for Polish-Ukrainian relations, but also for relations between other countries.
Zwrócenie zamiast w przyszłość, to jednak zwrócenie w przeszłość.
Politics of memory is often carried out for specific need.
Często gęsto jednak pełnią cele bardzo doraźne. To tak myślę, że
anyway, all in all, it doesn't bring any good.
Nie przynoszą.
Let me say something out loud. How typical is it that, according to official data, more than 6 million, unofficially more than 8 million, Ukrainians work outside the borders? Two main receiving countries are Russia, where more than 2 million Ukrainians work, and Poland, where more than 1.2 million Ukrainians work. So, if we're talking about Ukrainian-Polish disagreements or problematic historical situations, while also looking at these numbers, well, I wouldn't like to be the one to draw the conclusions. So these were Central European writers at Maidan: Bohdan Zadura, Sandor Horvath, Petra Hulova. Thank you very much for joining us.